normally at home as you perhaps once used to, and actually someone to help talk you through that.
In a royal household where everything is timed, polished, and performed, no one ever expected raised voices, especially not behind palace doors. But when Queen Camilla was overheard sharply scolding Princess Charlotte during a private gathering at Sandringham, the delicate calm shattered completely, leaving everyone present stunned and unsettled. The usual hush of royal life broke. What followed wasn't a public outburst or a leaked remark to the press. It was Catherine, calm, composed, graceful but resolute, stepping forward in defense of her daughter in a way that made every witness pause and absorb the gravity of the moment. Her response didn't just shift the energy in the room, it fundamentally reshaped how the family perceived authority, motherhood, and legacy. This was the moment that transformed whispers into history. A day that had been meant to feel simple and ordinary suddenly gained weight and tension. It began like one of those quiet royal afternoons, designed to remind the public that even monarchs have family days. Sandringham welcomed a small, intimate gathering. Senior royals and children, a private lunch, and an indoor stroll through the carefully curated gardens and the Winter Gallery, where the echoes of history seemed almost tangible. No cameras, no red carpets, no flashes, just long tables with polished cutlery, neatly folded linen, and the delicate scent of roses drifting through the air. Tradition and familiarity intertwined seamlessly, but beneath that calm, a subtle fragility pulsed quietly, like a hidden thread under tension, waiting for the smallest spark. Catherine had arrived early with Charlotte and Louis, while William joined shortly after. The children had been anticipating this visit all morning. Sandringham was more than a house. It was a place of warmth, memory, and subtle echoes of laughter past, where Diana had once walked with them as toddlers, a sanctuary that still felt safe, welcoming, and full of childhood wonder. Charlotte thrived in these visits, wandering hallways with wide, curious eyes, asking questions only a child could dare to ask. She was at the age where innocence meets sharp observation, old enough to notice details adults often missed, young enough to speak freely without hesitation. The gathering was informal, a private lunch among family, followed by a leisurely stroll through the Winter Gallery, a corridor lined with centuries of royal portraits, glass cabinets, and embroidered chairs that spoke of tradition and quiet discipline. Camilla had personally arranged the post-lunch event, overseeing the room, managing the schedule, and even orchestrating seating. Everything had to flow perfectly, every gesture and movement seamless and proper. Yet behind her composed smile, those closest to her noticed a growing tension, a tightening in her jaw, a flicker in her eyes. Whispers circulated about her mounting frustration with the younger generation, moments where she had felt dismissed, outpaced, or quietly sidelined. That afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point the instant Charlotte entered the room. Observers said the air shifted immediately. Charlotte, dressed in a forest green dress, hair pinned neatly with a simple barrette, smiled politely, carrying herself with composed poise. Camilla, arriving from the opposite side, was engaged with another guest, until her gaze fell on Charlotte, standing near a portrait of Queen Elizabeth. It was a moment like any other, until Charlotte asked a question that would send Camilla spiraling and turn what had been a peaceful, private afternoon into a scene no one present would ever forget. Royal life may be rehearsed, but it is always one breath away from eruption. For Catherine, who had stepped away to take a call in the adjoining corridor, it became instantly clear that something had broken, and she would have to be the one to restore order, not with noise or anger, but with truth, and that truth would change everything. Charlotte's innocent question. The Winter Gallery was alive with history, walls lined with portraits of long-gone monarchs, glass cabinets holding forgotten medals, and embroidered chairs rarely sat upon for decades. For most adults, it was a room of reverence, stiffness, and quiet respect, but to Charlotte, it was alive, full of questions, wonder, and untamed curiosity. Her fingers hovered politely near a portrait at eye level. It was Queen Elizabeth II, young and radiant, wearing a royal blue sash and crown. Charlotte tilted her head and turned to the woman nearest to her queen. "Camilla, did Granny ever sit on that chair?" she asked softly, curiosity clear in her tone. Camilla, caught off guard, blinked. "Which chair?" she asked, clipped but polite. Charlotte pointed toward the antique throne beneath the portrait. "That one. Did Granny Elizabeth ever sit in it, or is it just for looking?" To most, it would have been a sweet, innocent question, the kind a child asks when connecting past and present, but Camilla's expression shifted. A few staff stood nearby, yet none close enough to intervene. For reasons unclear to some witnesses, Camilla took the question personally. Her face tightened, shoulders rose slightly. Her voice, no longer gentle, dropped with sharp authority. "Those chairs are not for playing, Charlotte," she snapped. "They are part of royal history and not yours to fuss over." Charlotte blinked. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Something cold, sharp, and unfamiliar cut through the warmth of her question. She stepped back, hands folded, her lower lip trembling slightly. But she did not cry. She did not answer. Camilla continued. "You may be a princess, but you are not the authority on everything you see. Learn your place, young lady." Her voice carried across the room. A staff member near the archway turned sharply. Another guest lowered their glass mid-sip. Charlotte remained frozen, not in fear, but in disbelief, and in that instant, Catherine returned. She re-entered through the adjoining corridor just as Camilla finished her final words. Charlotte's stiff posture, her averted gaze, the flush rising in her cheeks, all of it told the story instantly. Catherine understood immediately what had occurred, every nuance visible in her daughter's stance. The room fell silent. Even the ticking of the mantel clock sounded deafening. Camilla hadn't noticed Catherine enter, but everyone else had. In that silence, the weight of her words sank deeply into the walls, pressing on everyone in the room. Charlotte looked up at her mother. Catherine's gaze did not move toward her daughter first. It locked on Camilla, calm, steady, but radiating a presence that demanded attention and respect. Everyone in the room could feel it. Something significant was about to unfold. Catherine's response would not just defend a child, it would define a moment none present would ever forget. Camilla's sudden outburst. The silence thickened as she realized too late that her words were overheard, not just by aides or lingering guests, but by Catherine herself, standing at the threshold, her stillness commanding the room's full attention. Camilla instinctively straightened, brushing an invisible thread from her sleeve as if to compose herself. Yet her posture betrayed her. Control had slipped, even if only for a moment. In the royal family, even a single misstep can echo for generations. Camilla had never meant to lose her temper, but behind her smile and pearls had been a storm of pressure, quietly building over months and finally erupting in that defining moment for all to witness. The younger royals were increasingly at the centre of public adoration. The press clung to every photograph of Catherine, every appearance by the Wales children. Every kind gesture Charlotte gave to a stranger became front-page fodder. It wasn't jealousy in the way tabloids describe it. It was something older, quieter, a fear that legacy could slip past her grasp, and that no amount of charity dinners, state appearances, or loyalty to the crown could replace the unspoken, lasting bond the public still held with Diana. And there was Charlotte, Diana's granddaughter, curious, thoughtful, instinctively graceful. Her question about the chair wasn't a challenge, it was innocence itself. But Camilla heard it as one. She had read too much into the gesture, the phrasing, the tone, the way the child had pointed. A voice usually soft and restrained in such company snapped through the air before Camilla even realized it herself. And now the aftermath stood before her, in the form of Catherine, calm, silent, every inch a portrait of composure. Charlotte didn't move. She hadn't cried or darted behind her mother. She simply stood, hands folded behind her back, eyes cast downward, not in shame, but in quiet confusion. She had asked a simple question, and yet the weight of what followed had landed fully upon her. Camilla, sensing the impact of her own words, forced a thin, brittle smile. "It's nothing," she said quickly, waving her hand as though brushing away the tension, pretending it was a misunderstanding. "Charlotte is just inquisitive." She let out a small laugh, fragile and brittle. No harm done. But Catherine still hadn't spoken. She stepped forward slowly, her gaze fixed unwaveringly on Camilla. Behind her, a footman subtly closed the gallery door to give the women privacy, but several in the hallway had already heard everything. Camilla tried to reclaim control. "I'm sure you understand how children can be curious," she said carefully. "Boundaries must be taught early, don't you think?" Catherine blinked once. Then, in a quiet voice that somehow carried like thunder, she spoke. "Boundaries," she said softly. "Yes, but not by belittling a child's voice." Camilla stiffened, her mouth slightly open. Everyone else fell still. It was no longer about a chair, it was about dignity. And in that moment, it became clear that Catherine had not entered to escalate a scene. She had come to draw a line, one that would be remembered long after the portraits faded and the doors of Sandringham were closed. There are moments in royal history that change nothing on the surface, but everything beneath. When Catherine stepped into the room at Sandringham, she did not raise her voice or issue accusations. She entered with the grace of the future, but the presence of a mother, quietly commanding. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, each sound echoing like a heartbeat, shifting every gaze in the gallery. Charlotte saw her first, a flicker of relief crossing her face for the briefest second. Camilla turned, already sensing what was about to come. Though she had no idea how quietly devastating it would be, Catherine said nothing at first. She approached Charlotte, crouched gently to her level, and brushed a hand softly down her daughter's arm. "Are you all right, darling?" she asked. Charlotte gave the tiniest nod, eyes wide, shoulders stiff. Catherine stood slowly, deliberately, and only then did her gaze meet Camilla's. The room remained silent, save for the soft creak of the gallery door as it closed behind them. The tension wasn't in volume, it was in the restraint. Camilla offered a smile, habitual, empty of warmth. "It was just a little miscommunication," she said again, but Catherine did not return the smile. Her eyes were not on the room, nor the aides pretending not to exist. Her gaze pierced Camilla directly. "When words are misunderstood," Catherine said quietly, "what I heard was something else." Camilla's expression remained fixed in polite formality. Charlotte asked a question about the throne chair. "I simply reminded her that some things in this house are not for touching," Catherine continued, taking a slow, measured breath. "Charlotte asked about her great-grandmother," she said. "She didn't climb the chair. She didn't disrespect it. She only asked if Queen Elizabeth had ever used it. That's curiosity, not misbehaviour. A pin could have dropped and been heard." Even the portraits on the wall seemed to pause, listening. Camilla's lips pressed together, tight. "Children need boundaries," Catherine continued. "Yes, but adults need to model them with care, especially in this house." Her words held no venom, only precision. It was not anger that guided her voice, but principle. A line had been crossed, not just in tone, but in presence. The words aimed at Charlotte were not discipline. They were dismissive. They reminded Catherine of another woman who had once walked these halls, asking questions and being silenced. She would not allow history to repeat itself. She reached for Charlotte's hand. "Come, sweetheart," she said. As they turned to leave the gallery, Camilla remained frozen in place. She had no response. Catherine had not shouted. She hadn't even raised her voice. But what she said landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling far beyond the walls of that room. In a family that had so often chosen silence over truth, Catherine had chosen to speak, with power, not volume. And in that instant, the entire royal order shifted. Silence gripped the room like a living thing. After Catherine's words, the air became heavier than silence itself. No one dared move. The few aides stationed by the door, senior staff pretending to examine paintings, even Camilla herself, all frozen, suspended in the gravity of the moment. Catherine had not raised her voice, yet the authority behind her tone pierced centuries of unspoken rules. This wasn't just a mother protecting her child. It was the future Queen of England reminding the present one of responsibility, fairness, and presence. Charlotte walked beside her mother with quiet dignity, her small hand securely wrapped in Catherine's. She did not glance back. She did not need to. Whatever had passed between these two of the monarchy's most prominent women had concluded, but its echo had just begun. Camilla remained alone in front of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, hands clasped, posture tall, yet drained of colour, authority, and momentum. She was accustomed to commanding every room and setting the tone, yet Catherine's words had achieved something rare. They had stopped her completely. One steward cleared his throat softly, breaking the unbearable stillness. He moved toward the tray of tea, careful not to disturb the lingering power in the air. Another aide whispered to a nearby attendant who quickly exited the room. No one acknowledged the moment outwardly, and yet everyone felt it. In royal households, it is often what is left unspoken that wields the most power. In this case, Catherine's deliberate choice to speak had created a vacuum, a moment where no one else dared offer a word, and the room itself seemed to lean forward, absorbing the gravity of what had just occurred. Camilla finally turned toward the doorway, perhaps hoping someone might intercept her, soften the moment, or redirect the atmosphere, but no one moved. Even her closest staff understood that this was no ordinary scene to smooth over. This was a line drawn too clearly to erase. Catherine and Charlotte did not return to the gathering that afternoon. A quiet message was passed along. The Princess of Wales had taken her daughter for a walk in the gardens. It was delivered with warmth, without apology, and with unmistakable finality. The matter was closed. Catherine had defended her daughter, not with vengeance, but with truth. She had reminded the monarchy that authority without compassion was meaningless. It was a lesson in leadership few would ever forget. As the rest of the family resumed their polite conversation, carefully avoiding the subject, the room remained haunted. Not because it had been theatrical, but because it had been real. In a palace built on protocol and centuries of expectation, a single honest moment had cracked the marble facade, and everyone understood it. Tension lingered in the air, thick and palpable, like a storm about to break over calm waters. The silence after Catherine's departure was far from empty. It was weighted with reflection, with subtle guilt, and a quiet realization that something had irreversibly shifted. No one in that room could restore what had been unsettled. Her words had made the walls tremble as Catherine and Charlotte walked down the corridor, their footsteps muted by the thick royal carpets, echoing like a soft drumbeat of change. The gallery door closed slowly behind them, yet her words lingered, resonating like distant thunder. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't embarrassed anyone, but what she said, and how she said it, left an imprint deeper than any public scandal could. In a few measured sentences, Catherine had spoken the unspoken truth inside palace walls. Being royal does not excuse cruelty, and even those born into crowns deserve respect. Inside the gallery, no one echoed her words, yet everyone replayed them silently. Charlotte had asked about her great-grandmother. That was curiosity, not misbehavior. That single line cut through generations of silence that had long constrained the women of that family. Catherine hadn't merely corrected Camilla, she had corrected a culture that had often valued control over compassion. Her action spoke louder than any public proclamation ever could. Camilla's team attempted to regain the composure of the room. One aide asked if tea should be served. Another suggested a walk to the stables. No one responded with energy. The spell had been broken. Politeness had ended. The contrast between Catherine's calm conviction and Camilla's flustered composure made the message unmistakable. Word of the encounter spread quietly through the palace, whispered between security officers, kitchen staff, and private secretaries. No opinions were offered. Only Catherine's words were repeated. Boundaries, yes, but not by belittling a child's voice. They echoed through the halls, not as gossip, but as quiet reckoning. In the past, confrontations like this would have been buried, managed, or smoothed over with handshakes and carefully edited photographs. But Catherine left no room for reinterpretation. Her words were precise, controlled, and exact. They weren't intended for the press. They were intended for the room, but their ripple would extend far beyond it. Later that evening, she returned to the residence with Charlotte and Louis. William had already been briefed. When she recounted the gallery scene to him, she spoke plainly, without dramatization. She described Charlotte's question, Camilla's tone, and the coldness she had encountered, all delivered with the clarity and conviction only a mother possesses. William didn't ask questions. He said simply, "You did the right thing." No public statement would ever acknowledge the incident. No official report would record Charlotte's question or Camilla's sharp words, but those present would never forget. They had witnessed a future queen speak not as a royal, but as a mother. In doing so, she reminded everyone that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is a soft voice that says, "This ends here." Catherine's words didn't break protocol. They broke something far older, far more rigid. A cold tradition of silence. They reverberated in the hearts of everyone present, leaving an impression that would not fade with time. From that moment onward, the palace could never view Charlotte the same way again. Her mother had made history, and everyone had heard it. William stood beside Catherine as the sun dipped low over Sandringham. When he finally returned home, delayed by his helicopter, his mind had already been tethered to Catherine and the children. He hadn't expected a crisis, but Catherine's composed, unreadable expression told him everything. They sat together in the drawing room, children upstairs in pyjamas, free from drama or embellishment. Catherine recounted every detail: the gallery, The question, Camilla's reaction, the moment Charlotte froze. She described the quiet stillness of her daughter, a stillness only innocence interrupted by harshness could create. William didn't interrupt. He simply said what needed to be said. You did right by her. He spoke not only as a father, but as a son remembering his own mother being silenced in similar halls. He understood what it meant to stand beside someone dismissed. He knew how it felt to see a loved one shrink under scrutiny disguised as order, and he knew he would never allow it for his children. The next morning, William acted quietly. No threats, no confrontation, just a private conversation behind closed doors with Camilla. No aides, no note-takers, just the future king and the queen consort. Those passing the study said the door stayed closed for nearly 20 minutes. When it opened, Camilla left first. Calm, but pale. William followed silently a few minutes later. The tone of the household had shifted irrevocably. Aides who had once flinched when Charlotte entered now smiled easily. Camilla maintained distance, quiet and respectful. Charlotte, perceptive and composed, returned to her usual curiosity. Silence was not weakness, it was strategy. William understood the power of words, and when words were unnecessary, Catherine had drawn the line. He ensured it would remain firm. Together they moved not for show, but for protection. The palace witnessed something unexpected. A couple ruled not by image, but integrity. A prince standing beside his wife, not just beside, but behind his daughter. A mother whose voice could not be softened, even in the presence of a queen. This was no scandal, no war, something far more enduring. A reminder that true power is not in the crown worn, but in how one guards those who cannot speak as loudly for themselves. And in that, William and Catherine stood unshaken. Behind closed doors, the palace machinery quietly hummed. No press release, no public leak, no headline-grabbing fallout. Yet within the upper echelons of royal administration, the incident involving Camilla, Charlotte, and Catherine had sparked a chain reaction, not through scandal, but through its profound symbolic significance, echoing far beyond the polished walls of Sandringham. A generational boundary had been drawn, and the institution had to decide whether to ignore it or respect it. Senior aides met in small groups, some revisiting existing protocols regarding interactions with the children, especially during formal or semi-private engagements. One long-serving advisor suggested the royal household needed a reminder of the soft lines, meaning emotional boundaries, personal space, and tone. When addressing the young royals, another quietly observed that Catherine had shifted the tone of expectation, and it would be unwise to pretend nothing had happened. The Queen's private secretary received a briefing, not a formal document, but a careful verbal summary of the incident and its handling. The focus was not on the disagreement, but on Catherine's conduct, William's quiet follow-up, and Charlotte's calm and measured behaviour afterward. The message was unmistakable. The Princess of Wales had handled the situation with dignity, restraint, and clarity. She had not embarrassed anyone, yet she had drawn a line, and it had been noticed. Camilla, for her part, maintained public composure, appearing the following day at a scheduled event in Norfolk, smiling tightly and adhering closely to the script. Those nearest to her noted a distinct coolness in her energy, a quiet acknowledgement that she had crossed an invisible line, not just with a child, but with the future queen. Even long-time supporters understood better than to suggest she was in the right. Catherine and William made no further mention of the moment, not to staff, not to friends, not even in passing. Their silence was deliberate, not to bury the truth, but to protect Charlotte from unnecessary noise. Everyone who needed to know understood the message. The royal household would not tolerate emotional carelessness, especially toward children. Among the younger staff, admiration quietly grew. Some had entered royal service believing change was distant, yet now they saw it quietly unfolding from within. Catherine's approach, grace under fire, calm correction, unwavering motherhood, set a new tone for influence wielded with care. One junior aide remarked that evening, "It wasn't about control, it was about care." And in those simple words, the palace saw its future reflected, not in spectacle, but in quiet strength of character. The incident would never appear in official archives, yet for those who bore witness, it marked a quiet turning point in how the next era of monarchy would be led, with humility, clarity, and an unshakable sense of what truly matters behind the crown. For years, the royal family had existed on a careful balance of silence and symbolism. Discomfort was smoothed over with polite smiles. Friction was buried under flawless photographs, and children, especially heirs, were expected to behave with royal grace, even when too young to comprehend it fully. But in that single moment at Sandringham, when Catherine stepped between Camilla and Charlotte with calm, resolute words, everything shifted, not in spectacle, but in spirit. Catherine didn't make a scene. She didn't call attention or demand apologies. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She named what was wrong and honoured a child's voice, which in any other royal generation might have been silenced. It was the kind of moment Diana had rarely been allowed. The protection Catherine provided her daughter mirrored what Diana herself had often lacked, and that made it unforgettable. Behind palace walls, people began rethinking what it meant to be royal. It was no longer just about protocol. It was about presence. Catherine had shown that a future queen could lead with emotional intelligence, setting boundaries wrapped in grace. Motherhood wasn't a side role to her title. It was what gave her authority its weight. Charlotte learned that day that her mother would always stand for her, and that her voice mattered. Even in a palace where voices were often hushed, staff walked away in awe, not because Catherine had embarrassed Camilla, but because she had chosen integrity over spectacle. The ripple effect extended throughout the family. Distant cousins, entitled in-laws, and others became more measured in their conversations and interactions. Invitations to engagements with the children were now considered more thoughtfully. Camilla, though not publicly rebuked, became more restrained in her interactions, not out of fear, but from understanding that Catherine's quiet strength was deliberate, and that the monarchy's future relied on more than image. This moment became an invisible watermark on the crown's legacy. It would never be in official records. Yet within the palace, it became a reference point for how the next generation would lead. For Catherine, it wasn't a victory. It was a promise. To her daughter, her family, and the kingdom she hoped to shape. A kingdom where kindness was not weakness, where a child's question could be met with wonder, and where queens ruled not by fear, but by love. History may never write about the day Catherine stood in that gallery, but those present will never forget. In one quiet moment, the future queen redefined power, and she did it without raising her voice. Not through scandal, but through dignity. She didn't shout. She didn't seek attention. With a single act of maternal courage, she reminded the monarchy that true power lies in protection, not position. Her words were for Charlotte, but they echoed for every child ever told to shrink into silence. Camilla may have held the title of queen consort, but that day it was Catherine who ruled, with grace, clarity, and unshakable love. She didn't just defend Charlotte, she set a new standard for royal strength. In doing so, she quietly redefined the monarchy's future. This story wasn't about conflict, it was about conviction, a mother standing for her child, and for a lasting, different kind of legacy. Thank you for watching. If you believe quiet courage speaks louder than tradition, that love is the truest form of leadership, and that Catherine showed us what true royalty looks like, then like, comment, and subscribe. Because history is not always made with a crown. Sometimes it is made with a whisper.